You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host, author, and occasional misanthrope, Juliette Miranda. Go to theunwritablerant.com and you can subscribe on iTunes or connect with the show on Facebook and Twitter.
Well, hey there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda. Welcome to episode 84 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. Sitting next to me, I have what may be my last glass of bourbon for quite a while, which I'll explain in a minute. But that means right now I am very anxious to taste this. So y'all join me in a toast, won't you? Grab a glass, raise it up, and let's say cheers. This is a crazy kind of bourbon, y'all. Today, I am drinking Smooth Ambler Contradiction bourbon whiskey. This is a blended whiskey. So on one side of it, you've got a very young wheated bourbon. On the other, you've got a rather high rye bourbon. The two are blended together to make this particular whiskey. And I gotta say, at $70-ish a bottle, it's overpriced. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a tasty bourbon, but I'm not blown away by it, which is unfortunate. It is surprisingly sweet and incredibly full-bodied. At the front, it's got a very creamy, sort of buttery flavor. And then on the back comes in that sweetness, very fruity almost, kind of like a dried pomegranate in a way. And then finishes out, it's got more of that buttery sort of flavor, and then it's very smooth and a little bit vanilla-y. I like it, but again, y'all, I don't like it $70 much. However, I will say it is very easy to drink. I've got it on a little bit of ice because at 100 proof, I found that it was just a little too strong. So some ice mellows it out, makes it very easy to drink. Now up front, I said this may be my last glass of bourbon for a little while. Don't panic, I'm not jumping on any wagons or anything. It's just that as y'all are listening to this, my guy and I are winging our way to Aruba. And there are a lot of things in Aruba, but there is not a whole lot of whiskey. Instead, I am going to be drinking myself a whole lot of rum and sangria. Aruba truly is something of a magical place, and what I love most about it is just how far off the grid we are. Now, since my guy and I are on our vacation, I didn't want to leave y'all hanging with nothing, so I've put together some of my favorite stories from older episodes. And this first story is actually about the trip that we took to Aruba last year. Now, my guy and I, being the way we are friendly sorts of people. We get chatty every once in a while, so we met some, rather interesting characters on that last trip. Some of them were nice, and some of them, let's just say they were a little bit more criminal. So for this first story, I would like to introduce you to a real-life Heisenberg. Oh yes, they exist, and we met one in Aruba. Check it out, y'all. It happened probably, I guess, in the middle of our trip. And it was the long end of a very long day. You know, my guy and I had been drinking since about, 10 o'clock in the morning. And it was maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, and we had decided that we needed snacks. And it's amazing the way different drinks respond to different snacks. You know, when I'm in Chicago and I'm drinking, just straight bourbon, or even if I'm in Nashville or wherever, I find myself just craving deep fried crap. I find that like a plate of cheese fries or, cheese curds or something just goes really well with, just a straight bourbon drunk. But when, you're in a more tropical setting and you're drinking, more fruity cocktails, more rum-based cocktails, and you've been doing it in the hot sunshine, you find that you really need something a little bit lighter, something that has more flavor but still really satisfying. And I'm going to tell you about the most perfect thing in the world. This would be a 24-hour sushi bar that we found across the street from our hotel. The most genius thing on the planet, I swear. We stumbled into there and we had the most incredible late-night snack ever. Just a spicy eel hand roll, a couple of pieces of sashimi, and we were ready to go. I mean, it completely gave us our fourth wind. It was perfect. Although I suppose it was a little bit unfortunate, too. Because it led up to something that was terrifying and could have ended really, really badly. So we head back to our hotel. My guy heads to the bar and I go and I get us set up on the side, just with just in a lounge chair looking out at the ocean. Because I'm figuring this is where our night's going to end. We're just going to, settle down and breathe and then, head off to bed. But my guy comes back to me and he's kind of wired and a little, jazzed about something. And he goes, "You're not going to believe who I just met." Well, I think he's met a celebrity or something, He has this uncanny ability to just spot the one celebrity in a room and become best friends with him. Whereas I'm so oblivious to everybody around me that I once stepped on Jack Nicholson's foot and I didn't even realize it until my girlfriend started squealing. But my guy hadn't met a celebrity. No, in fact, he'd actually met a drug lord. Now, when he said this, I kind of called bullshit. Who, number one, calls himself a drug lord, and then two, admits to it in public to a stranger? But my guy, he kind of explained it. He's like, "No, I went to the bar. This creepy guy was sitting next to me, and he's hammered with his wife, and they kind of just started talking casually." And my guy's like, "I just kind of sussed it out. We're talking about what we do for a living, and it just kind of came out that, he's a criminal." And he's like, "You've got to meet him." Now, I'd had enough cocktails in me, right, to make this seem like the greatest idea ever. Normally my stranger danger lights would be flashing on and off like a tornado siren. But no, I was pretty, loosey-goosey. So I'm like, that sounds like a fun thing to do tonight. So, we walked back to the bar. And even with this guy's back to me, I immediately knew who he was. He looked like a freaking gargoyle from behind. Just all huge and stony. He had this greasy dark hair and was totally covered in tattoos. But these weren't the kind of tattoos that you get from a typical tattoo parlor. No. They were these black and bluish tattoos, the kind of colors that only come from a prison yard and a Bic pen. So my guy walks over to the bar and he places another order for us. And then he says hello to Breaking Bad. And they're all casual. "Oh, hey, you're still here, blah, blah, blah." And my guy says, "Let me introduce you to my wife." And it's at this particular juncture where I feel compelled to offer y'all kind of a public service announcement of sorts to save you from the horror that we endured. I think I'll call it How to Talk to Your Drug Lord and Not Die in the Process. Which brings me to point number 1. Never make eye contact. I did this and immediately regretted it. Because when I looked into those black pools of despair, I knew without any reservation that this man was indeed a drug lord and that he had, without a doubt, killed people. Maybe it was for sport, maybe revenge or out of boredom, or maybe just for lunch money, but I knew he'd killed people and he would have no qualms about doing it again. In just one glance, this animal scared the crap out of me. But hey, we were sitting in a very public bar. I'm a little buzzed, and there's no need to be rude. So I shook the maniac's hand and introduced myself to his wife, who was sitting next to him and shooting tequila. And this brings me to point number 2. Because in not wanting to be rude, we attempted to engage in casual conversation with the world's scariest couple ever. So I can tell you that the last thing you ever want to do is give out distinguishing details about yourself. All we had to do was mention, totally offhand, very non-committal, that we live in the general Chicago area. And Breaking Bad looks up to utter, "I know people in Chicago." He didn't say it in a, my brother-in-law lives there kind of way, or a, I once had a layover there kind of way. No. When Breaking Bad tells you he knows people in your city, what he's really saying is, "I can find out where you live." And that means I now wince every time I start my car. And with that, things are starting to feel a little uncomfortable at this point. Because I don't like the way this goon is looking at my guy from the corners of his eyes. And I don't like the way he's looking at me so dominantly. But I don't want either of us to wind up in the trunk of a car because that would totally ruin our vacation. And that leads me to my next bit of advice. Don't piss your local drug lord off. My guy was clearly beginning to regret having poked this crazy with a stick. So he tries to lighten the mood a little bit. He's talking about how nice it is to be in Aruba, to relax on a vacation and disengage from work. But Breaking Bad doesn't really share this sentiment. So he tosses back a tequila shot and he goes, "I'm always on the job." To which I reply without even thinking, "Money never sleeps." I'm not sure what possessed me to say this. Mostly, it was impulse. This is something that I often say to my guy when he's working late. Of course, when my guy works late, he's closing a deal or reviewing a contract. He's not pouring concrete around some guy's feet. And I know this because Breaking Bad responds to my dumbass comment by saying, well, money may not sleep, but people do. Have you ever heard the phrase playing possum? I'm a big fan of the concept. It means to play dead, and the idea just makes sense to me because, really, there's no fun or point, I suppose, in messing around with something that can't respond. It works in the animal kingdom, right? Even some sharks do it, for fuck's sake. And at this point, as Breaking Bad dropped that nugget in our laps, I found myself wondering if the only way to escape this terrifying conversation without winding up on a milk carton would be to fake a stroke. Just picture it. You're sitting there, you're talking to this thug, right? And he's staring holes through you. And you want to get away, but you don't know how. So panic is really the mother of invention, and I'm proud to offer you this next bit of wisdom. If you can't play dead, play drunk. And it works, I swear. I immediately began to giggle like some deranged sorority girl, and I kind of stumble onto my guy as if I'm just so silly and so drunk that I couldn't possibly describe what this maniac looked like to a police officer. And in thinking like a drunk sorority girl, I decided to kind of turn the attention to Breaking Bad's wife, who, as we had been talking, had silently sucked down about 4 margaritas in a row. So I look at her and I'm like, well, hey, how did you two meet? And I'm hoping with all my might that her answer isn't something like, oh, Planned Parenthood. It turns out these 2 lovebirds had met when she was in high school, when, as she so delicately put it, he took her virginity when she was a sophomore. Now, it's a bit tricky to place the age of a confirmed killer because I'm assuming that kind of thing, ages a person early. Even so, just looking at this guy, it was clear he had a good 10 years on her. So y'all can do the math on that sexy equation. She had plenty more to say because she was ragingly drunk. Crazy, falling off her ass drunk. And this brings me to my biggest tip in how to talk to your local drug lord. Know when to walk away. Or run, as the case may be. Now that we'd woken his wife up, she wanted to make sure we understood that she wasn't just some drunken bimbo in a bar who happened to marry a rapist drug lord. No. She was special. She was an educated drunken bimbo in a bar who happened to marry a rapist drug lord. The problem was, she was hammered. Now, as I've said, my guy and I were buzzed. There's no doubt about that. But we hovered somewhere around like a 4 or a 5 on the drunken spectrum, while she had blown past 11 long before we even got to her. We're talking eyes rolling, drooling, slurring her words drunk, and very close to passing out on the bar. But that didn't stop her. It never stops any drunk, right? Because she wanted to tell us the saga of her education. And it was a spotty story. It was marked by monosyllabic utterances and obscenities. But the gist of it was that she was the first person in her family to go to college and continue on to graduate school. I'm sure her family is proud. I'm sure of it. Because really, there's no better way to utilize your higher education than locking yourself into a relationship with a guy that dodges black helicopters. But who am I to judge, right? I may have actually even been interested in hearing more of her story had she not been so obliterated. And I am thanking the great bartender in the sky for smiling down on us at that moment, because it was her absurd drunkenness that really gave us our chance to escape. After she had tried unsuccessfully to tell us that she'd just earned her master's degree in finance, which is a complicated sentence to spit out when you're swallowing back a vomit ball, she punctuated her story by climbing onto Breaking Bad and giving him a lap dance in front of us. And as lovely as this was, we made a hasty getaway, waving and thanking them for their time and, looking at each other and making really loud statements like, "Isn't the district attorney expecting us for breakfast tomorrow?" Fortunately, thankfully, we did not encounter those 2 crazy people again on the trip. And I can only say to y'all right now, this is exactly why I do not talk to strangers. And with that, I need another cocktail. Hang on. My guy and I can laugh about that story now, but I will tell you that in the moment, meeting that drug lord was terrifying. Some people, you just look at them and you know that they are fucked up. Of course, I'm guessing some people kind of feel that way around me too, so maybe I shouldn't be quite so judgy. And that brings me to this next story. It is one of my very favorite stories, inspired by the spring season and the whole concept of rebirth. Now, I'm going to warn you up front that this story does get a little grisly towards the end. And after hearing it, you may have some questions about who I am, really. I promise y'all, I am truly a nice person, but as a child, I did some questionable things. And with that, kick back, y'all, and brace yourselves for what has become known in my family as the bunny story. I think about all of the stories my mother has told my guy in the past. And I create this mental checklist, right? And it kind of mirrors those checklists that you see, when somebody's talking about all the characteristics of, say, a serial killer. What did that serial killer do as a child? They were an elitist. All right, that's me. They avoided contact with other people. Well, that's definitely me. They tortured animals as a child. I've never tortured animals, but I will say the bunny was dead when we found it. Now, I never tortured animals, of course, at least not living ones, which brings me to my story here. And I'm going to tell you something up front about this story because it's a very critical point. The bunny was dead when I found it. And because this is such an important fact, I'm going to say it again. The bunny was already dead when I got to it. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this is a horrible story. It's an awful, awful story. So if you are sensitive at all, if you have any moral qualms about religion, if you're passionate about Easter, then perhaps you should turn this podcast off. Because at this point, it's about to take a very dark, horrible turn. And leave it to my mother to remind me of this. I'd totally forgotten about this story. I have a lifetime repertoire of stupidity, and it runs really, really long. I will generally own up to most of it, but there are some stunts that I've just blocked from my mind, kind of like I block creepy people on Facebook. I click that button and it's gone. Now, my mother, however, has no such courtesy, and she has no problem with bringing these stories up to my guy, particularly the very first Easter that he spent with me and my family. I remember my mother that day, too. We were all sitting around the table. We were just talking. She was serving food. I think it was ham. There were potatoes and vegetables, and we're dishing stuff out. And it's very quiet and polite, and we're having a lovely time. And she just kind of looks at my guy as if, totally about to bring up a very casual topic. And she just smiles and said, "Hey, has Juliette ever told you the bunny story?" Now, my guy and I we were early on in our relationship. We were established as a couple. We knew we loved each other, but it was still, it was early, right? So we're still getting to know you a little bit. He's still getting comfortable with my family. So at this particular juncture in a relationship, your potential suitor, your possible future spouse should really only be subject to a certain number of quirks when he's talking with your parents. Maybe some playful ribbing about bad grades or jokes about bad hair decisions. Occasionally an embarrassing photo can come out. Animal mutilation stories, by my own personal standards at least, that kind of pushes the limits. And of course, my guy, he immediately sensed my discomfort and he just pounces, right? He digs his heel in and he's like, "I got to hear this story. I have to know." And I can see the file cabinet in his brain opening up, right? And he's got a little file folder. It says "for future use." And he's about to take notes, right? And my mother is just bristling now, and she can hardly contain her glee when she starts to tell him about the horrible thing I did as a kid. There's no way I can make this story sound good. There really isn't. All I can do is tell you that 5th grade was not really my best year. And I don't think it's a stellar time for anyone, really. Particularly those who, like me, were enrolled in a private Catholic school. Now, I was only enrolled in the school because of the curriculum, because it was a stellar school. Really great education there. The religious side of it, it was just kind of one of those things that, I had to deal with. Even so, it was kind of clear, pretty early on that I wasn't really private school material. I was definitely better suited for the public school trenches, and we all decided that unanimously come 6th grade. But in 5th grade, it was a bad year. In 5th grade, you're starting to really develop your core personality traits. You choose your friends based on shared interests and not so much, the fact that they live across the street from you. You start looking at people differently and seeing your relationship in the bigger picture of society. It very quickly becomes clear that there's kind of a hierarchy of things when you're in 5th grade. And it didn't help me at all that my mother supplemented my schoolwork with a steady stream of books on voodoo and Wicca and spiritualism and Satanism. I come from a family of voracious readers. So much so that they converted the 3rd floor of our house into a huge library. Just stacked with books. And it's a beautiful place. And early on, my mother said, you know what? You can read whatever you want in the library. You don't have to ask permission. Just go in there, find a book, and read it. It's fine. Ask me questions. Don't ask me questions. Whatever you want. So I found a spectacular number of books to read on my own, of course. But then there's my mother feeding me these other books. And she said that it would give me a broad understanding of life and philosophy. But I think she really did it to just screw with the nuns at school. Like Sister Juliette, I swear to God, she wore calluses on her fingers because she crossed herself so many times during my book reports. And so much so that by the 2nd semester, there was a ban on bringing in your own books to read in class. And that was truly all my fault. Now, of course, just, the nuns telling me that I couldn't read what I wanted, that they had to pre-approve my books, that was enough just to, spark that rebellion of mine. And it certainly didn't endear me to the rest of the class. Because, of course, like I said, by that time, social segregation and bullying are becoming a thing. I was a totally normal girl by every other respect. I was cute. I was personable, sort of. I didn't keep gym socks in my desk. I didn't weave safety pins through my fingers or gnaw on chalk or eat glue or anything like that. But the fact that I had this kind of penchant for the weird, it gave those cliques more than enough ammunition to exclude me. And I would like to be able to say that it was fine and that I could handle it. But, at 11 years old, you don't understand that it's better to not fit in. So I did my best, but it was horrible. I didn't fit in with anybody, and it wore down on me. And I'm sure if this were the present day, I would have been targeted for counseling. I would have been put on suicide prevention and maybe, a government watch list. But back then, it was just written off as me being a weirdo who didn't play well with others. I'll tell you, though, I wasn't too young to see the contradiction in all that. Because here I am going to this Catholic school, right, where we're told repeatedly in religion class to love thy neighbor and to do unto others. Yet when it came to any of my teachers helping me combat the vicious little bitches who would steal my lunch, who would hide my gym clothing, who would call me up, who would prank call me at midnight and say the most horrible things when my parents answered the phone, I got no help whatsoever. My classroom quickly became some sort of perverse reenactment of Lord of the Flies, and it was just awful. I dreaded going to school some days. Now, that's not to say I didn't have a friend. I did. For these purposes, I'll call him Jason, but he was this wonderful little boy who lived across the street from the school. Now, he would later come out to me when we were in high school, so you can kind of get a picture of, he was going through his own hell in 5th grade as well. And I remember the first time I met him, I think we were in 1st grade. We'd both been pulled out of church because we were making faces at the priest. And so we're both sent to stand in a corner or something ridiculous like that. And he leans over and he goes, you know what? We should both be friends. We're really weird. And that was definitely true. And that totally solidified our friendship from that point on. And we had the best time hanging out together. A typical play date for us, we used to reenact some of the stuff that we read in school. In fact, I remember us doing this incredible play. We put it on in the basement for his parents and his brothers and stuff. We did a reenactment of the beheading of Anne Boleyn. And we had sets and costumes and props. It was fantastic. We were doing collages in art class, which was fine, but he and I decided we were going to do some of our own, and we were going to sell them to our neighbors to make money for candy. Well, we didn't actually sell any, and that's probably because the, collages that we made, well, they were kind of based on some of our favorite movies, and mine might have been about Friday the 13th. I don't know. So needless to say, we kind of had, we had a very wacky, very loving, very wonderful friendship, but it was definitely a little wacky. So this one day, I went to his house after school and we're hanging out. And it's springtime. The ground is still a little squishy, but it's warm out and everything. So, we're kind of digging around in his backyard. And we encountered a fresh, dead baby bunny rabbit. I have no idea how the thing died. We were kind of poking at it a little bit, just to see what was going on. Because, we're kids, right? We're fascinated with this thing. It didn't have any claw marks on it. It didn't look like it had been mauled by a coyote or anything like that. It probably just, froze or something like that. I don't know. And like I said, we were fascinated by it. So, we're kind of just looking at each other and we're like, well, we got to do something with it. We didn't want to just leave it there. So my friend says, well, how about we leave it at the school? And we mulled that over a little bit. It was a good idea, but we'd both had a hellish day. We'd both been knocked into lockers, called horrible names. So just leaving it there didn't feel like enough of a statement. So I'm looking at the dead bunny on the ground. I'm looking at my friend and, like a burning bush, inspiration struck. And I look up and I go, let's crucify it. I mean, how hard could it be, right? Christ was a carpenter. And my friend's eyes just get really wide. And I'm thinking maybe for a moment that the idea is just a little too extreme for him. And if it had been, it would have been fine. I mean, I can't say that I had any real stock in the idea. It was just something that occurred to me, like, let's do this. So I would have blown it off if he wasn't interested, but he was my friend. He was my good friend. And the second he saw the potential of this, his eyes lit up as brightly as mine. And it's a good thing, too, because you really do need an accomplice for a good bunny crucifixion. So we raided his dad's workshop. It didn't take very much. We just had a couple of strips of plywood, some nails, the wounds of Christ, and all of a sudden we had a dripping monument of our rebellion. It was beautiful. So we snuck over to the church. And remember, this was the 80s, right? So there was no surveillance cameras on the grounds. There were no patrolmen wandering around or nosy neighbors wondering why there were two kids walking around without parental supervision. That's not what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, you could do whatever you wanted. And if nobody saw it, then it didn't happen. So we head up to the front door of the church. A lovely wooden door, thankfully. And we'd had these really long nails that we found in his dad's workshop, right? So we take our cross, start pounding it to the door, and the bunny is just kind of, hanging there with its mouth hanging open, its limbs all stretched out and everything. It was totally gory and horrible. And we paused and we looked and we felt empowered. It felt so goddamn good to do it. And we look at each other, we high-five each other when we run back home where we washed our hands and had some Oreos and juice. And I remember it as being one of the most satisfying moments of my childhood. And the next day, the reaction to our display was ridiculously overblown. Now, of course, overnight, the bunny hadn't really fared well. It had started to droop a little bit. It had attracted the attention of a whole lot of flies. So it really was kind of a bigger presentation than we had originally intended, which I guess is to our favor. So word of satanic desecration and black messes and pagan vandalism just swept through the entire school. Now, of course, remember, this is the 80s. And in the 80s, the nation was caught up for a really long time in this gripping terror of Satanism. Anytime a kid would run home from school crying, it was automatically assumed that, the teachers in that school had formed some sort of satanic cult and were subjecting this kid to weird and perverse rituals. If you Google Satanism in the 80s, you will come up with countless news stories and court cases about, all this ridiculous, overblown nonsense. There wasn't any Satanism in the 80s. None of this was going on. It was just the Salem witch concept. So, of course, this is what my school starts to immediately assume. There are witches among us. And they called this huge assembly. I remember sitting there, and I was sitting next to my friend, and he and I, we were both totally cool with this. We just thought it was silly. We hadn't done it to make a statement necessarily about religion. We just did it to feel better about ourselves, to know that we had one-upped these horrible people who really had been nasty to us for a long time. So these stupid people, they're standing up in front of the school, right? It was the head priest, it was the principal, and they're saying things like, this was a horrific act of vandalism on sacred grounds. It was an act of religious terror on us, us good people. Why would somebody do that to us? And if you have any information about this, please let us know, because we want to make sure that these people are punished who did this. So they say, we're going to pray on the matter, and we're going to ask the Holy Ghost to help us find the culprit. Well, the Holy Ghost really isn't much of a detective, because within a few weeks, the whole thing was written off as a prank. I have no idea why no one ever questioned me and my little friend about it. I mean, seeing as how I was, known as the resident voodoo priestess of the 5th grade, you would have thought I would have been a prime suspect. Maybe they just considered it was, too big of an act for a little 5th grader to pull off. Maybe Jesus saw the humor in it. I don't know. But my little friend and I never got caught for it. And let me tell you something. For as horrible of a thing as that was to do, it really felt good. And I suppose that's kind of one of the check marks for a serial killer. I don't know. But I can tell you that for my friend and I, for the rest of that school year, we held our heads up a little bit higher. Now, you're probably wondering how my mother came to find out about this story. And I'll tell you, I was so proud of what I did. I told her about it when she picked me up at my friend's house that day. We were sitting in the car, she's driving me home, and I recounted exactly everything that we did because I didn't really feel like I'd done anything all that wrong. Now, I don't remember her exact reaction. I think she asked me a couple of questions, stuff like, why did you do that? How did that make you feel? Do you have any strong desire to do that to our household pets? And I think she just kind of gauged my reaction a little bit. She didn't freak out. I certainly wasn't punished. And I never heard about it again. Except, of course, that one lovely day, that one Easter luncheon where my mother decides she has to announce this story to my guy. But let me tell you something. I think she's harboring just a little bit of sadistic pride. And obviously so am I. But wow, just my guy hearing this story and everything. And there's very little I can do to defend myself. I can say everything. I can say, I was in 5th grade, one dead bunny on a stick does not make me a bad person. And it's not like I removed its head for dramatic effect. I just crucified something that was already dead. I suppose I should be relieved that my guy saw the humor in it and that he understood where I was coming from when this happened. That he didn't call the local psych ward to send me off to a farm where there's lots of, red balloons and balls to play with. Of course, doesn't matter where we are. If we're walking down the street, if we're at the, zoo, for example, he will look at me every time we see a bunny rabbit, raise an eyebrow and say, I wonder what the Easter Jesus would do with this bunny rabbit. And I can't say I really blame him for it. Well, y'all, I hope hearing the bunny story hasn't changed your opinion of me. I'm sure my guy and I will return from Aruba with tons of crazy stories for y'all. Have a great week. I will be back next to chat with you again. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablерant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all lonely. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.